The HOA called the cops on me for trespassing, until the sheriff told them I owned every inch of land leading to their lake. It started with a knock on my cabin door one quiet afternoon. "Sir, we've had reports of trespassing," the deputy said, his boots crunching on the gravel. Behind him stood three members of the Lakeview Estates HOA, arms folded, faces burning with self-righteousness. Apparently, the board believed my newly purchased property was their community lakefront. I handed the deputy my deed. "It's all there," I said, tapping the seal from the county office. He squinted at the paperwork, then at the angry crowd. "Looks like he's right," he muttered. The HOA president, Linda Graff, nearly choked on her words. "This can't be legal," she said. But it was. The truth was simple and ironic. While the HOA was busy fighting about landscaping and mailbox paint, the state quietly auctioned off an unused parcel of reserve land, a buffer strip around the lake. They assumed no one would bid. But I did. For $38,000, I bought the 47-acre ring that legally encircled their beloved Lakeview Reservoir. The lake itself belonged to the state, but every access path, dock, and private beach crossed my land. It wasn't vengeance at first, just curiosity. Then they called the cops. The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering: mandatory HOA hearing, property boundary dispute. The irony made me laugh. They were calling a meeting about my land in their clubhouse, which, according to my new survey, sat a few feet over my property line. When I arrived, the air inside was thick with that artificial lemon scent they used to mask mildew. Rows of chairs were filled with board members and residents, all wearing the same tight smiles, the kind that said they'd already made their judgment before I even opened my mouth. Linda Prescott, the HOA president, sat at the head of the long table like a judge in a makeshift courtroom. Her pearls gleamed under the fluorescent light, and her folder was color-coded, blue tabs for violations, red for legal. "Mr. Harlan," she began in her syrupy tone, "thank you for joining us today. We're here to discuss the disruption you've caused within our community." "Disruption?" I asked, leaning against the back wall. "Yes," she said, flipping a page as if rehearsed. "Unauthorized digging, fence construction without HOA approval, confrontations with residents. We value harmony here, and your recent behavior, well, has made many feel uncomfortable." A few heads nodded in unison, like trained pigeons. I let her talk, let her build her case with that smug assurance people get when they believe they hold power. Then, when she finally paused, I walked up to the table and set down a thick brown folder. The thud echoed through the room. "Here, the boundary survey," I said evenly. "Dated, notarized, and verified by the county engineer." I slid the papers across to her. "Every inch you've paved, landscaped, or beautified beyond this line is on my property." The silence that followed was almost musical. The treasurer, a man who looked like he'd been waiting his whole life to scold someone, broke first. "You can't just fence people out of their lake. It's a community amenity." I turned toward him slowly. "Community? I don't recall joining your community. I own that access road. I own the land up to the water line. You've been trespassing for years." Linda's smile faltered. "There must be some mistake. We've had access for decades." "Decades of assumption don't equal ownership," I said. "You built your picnic area, your kayak racks, and your dock on private land. My land." Someone in the back whispered, "Is that even legal?" "It is," I said, "and I'm giving you notice. Within 30 days, remove your structures. After that, the county will handle it, or I will." A murmur rippled through the room. Linda's pen trembled slightly as she tapped it against her folder. "Mr. Harlan, surely we can reach a friendly resolution. We're neighbors, after all." I smiled, not kindly. Funny thing about neighbors, they usually knock before building on your property. The room tensed. Even the air conditioner seemed to quiet down, as if the entire building was holding its breath. I turned to leave but stopped at the door. "You've had free rein for too long," I said. "Now it's time to pay attention to the lines that matter." The treasurer muttered something about calling their lawyer. Linda's voice followed me out, brittle and sharp. "You'll regret making enemies here, Mr. Harlan." I didn't bother looking back. "I'm not making enemies," I said, "just reclaiming what's mine." Outside, the sun was setting over the lake, my lake, the water turning gold in the light. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like I was trespassing. It felt like I was home. By Monday morning, I was done waiting for courtesy, apologies, or further review. The HOA had used words for years: emails, warnings, memos, community standards. Now it was time to use something sturdier. Within a week, I hired a local crew, 3 men from a fencing outfit in town who didn't ask too many questions, just looked at the survey map and whistled low. "They really built this close to your property line?" one of them asked, driving a stake into the earth. "Closer," I said. "They built over it." The work began at dawn. The first cedar post went in with a dull thud that echoed across the valley like a declaration. I'd chosen cedar on purpose, weather-resistant, natural, and strong. Each post was driven deep into the soil, lined perfectly along the old survey markers that the HOA had ignored for decades. By noon, a ribbon of posts stretched from the edge of the gravel trail all the way down to the lake access point, the one they liked to call community waterfront. The chain barriers came next, thick, matte black steel links that caught the sunlight like a warning flare. When the crew bolted up the first sign, I couldn't help but smile at the clean, white letters. Private reserve, no trespassing, owner ENFORCES rights. By mid-afternoon, a few curious residents had gathered. Golf carts lined the path. Some filmed the process with their phones. Others just stood there, whispering, eyes wide as if I were building a fortress instead of a fence. Linda Prescott was the first official to arrive in her pearl earrings, floral scarf, and righteous indignation. Her SUV rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, and she climbed out like a queen surveying her stolen land. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Building a boundary," I said, not looking up. "You know, those things property owners use to keep out trespassers." "This is public space," she snapped. "You can't just block the lake." I handed her a laminated copy of the survey. "You keep saying that word, public. Maybe you should look it up." Her face turned crimson. "We'll see about this," she hissed, pulling out her phone. "The board will be hearing from our attorney." "I hope he can read maps," I said. She stormed off, heels crunching the gravel. By sunset, word had spread through every cul-de-sac and Facebook group. Posts appeared online with photos of the new fence, some calling me a greedy land hoarder, others asking, "Wait, does he really own the lake road?" The comments turned into arguments. Neighbors fought each other digitally while the cedar post stood quietly, unmoved. The next morning, the retaliation began. They organized what they called a paddle protest. About a dozen residents showed up at the water's edge with kayaks and paddle boards, waving homemade signs that said things like "access for all" and "our lake, our right." One man even dressed in a colonial hat, shouting about tyranny by fence. I watched from my porch with a mug of coffee, amused more than angry. Then came the letters, official HOA correspondence, printed on glossy stationery with their logo embossed in gold. "Dear Mr. Harlan, your recent obstruction of community access violates HOA Charter Clause 6.2, shared amenities. You are hereby directed to remove all physical barriers immediately or face legal action and daily fines of up to $1,000. They sent 3 of those letters in 1 week. I framed the first one and hung it in my kitchen. On the 4th day, a white county truck pulled up. A ranger stepped out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses glinting in the afternoon light. I could tell from his walk that he'd already heard a story, probably Linda's version of events, complete with dramatic phrasing about illegal seizure of shared resources. "Afternoon," he said. "You Mr. Harlan?" "I am. I'm just here to take a look at this boundary situation. Got some complaints from the HOA about a possible encroachment." "Of course you did," I said, leading him to the start of the fence. "Take all the time you need." He studied the survey markers, compared them to the county map on his tablet, and paced a few times along the trail. Every few steps, he muttered something under his breath. Then he stopped, pushed his sunglasses up, and looked at me with a faint grin. "Well," he said, "everything looks legitimate, sir. You're right on the recorded line. Those folks over there." He nodded toward the cluster of houses. "They've been using your land for a while." I could see the HOA members watching from a distance, their faces expectant, waiting for him to scold me. Instead, he signed his clipboard. "Looks like you bought smart." I smiled. "No," I said, taking a slow breath as I looked out over the lake. "I bought patiently." He chuckled, tipped his hat, and drove off, leaving a fresh set of tire tracks that crossed exactly over the boundary they'd all thought was theirs. That night, the neighborhood chat groups went silent for the first time in weeks. Even Linda didn't post. But silence, I learned, doesn't mean surrender. It's the sound of plans forming. Over the next few days, I noticed new faces driving by slowly, their eyes lingering on the fence. Someone left a folded note on my gate. "You'll regret this. This community has ways of dealing with people like you." I burned it in the fire pit without reading the rest. Each morning I walked the line, checking the posts, the chains, the signs. The air felt different now, lighter, maybe even proud. For the first time, I could stand on my land and not feel like a guest in someone else's backyard. One evening, as the last bit of daylight shimmered on the water, I saw Linda standing across the barrier, arms crossed. "You really think this is over?" she said. "It's not over," I replied. "It's just finally starting where it should have started years ago, at the line." Her lips pressed tight. "You've made a lot of enemies." "Then they can line up," I said. "There's plenty of fence for everyone." She left without another word. The lake was quiet again, rippling softly beneath the orange glow of dusk. The fence stretched behind me, not just wood and metal, but something stronger. A statement. A boundary long overdue. And as the crickets rose and the wind carried faint echoes of distant arguments from the HOA's direction, I knew one thing for sure: they weren't finished fighting. But neither was I. Because once you've reclaimed what's yours, the hardest thing to do is ever let it go again. The discovery came by accident, as most dangerous truths do. It was late morning, the sky heavy with gray clouds, when I went out to verify the final boundary points near the lake's western edge. The ground there was soft, riddled with cattails and roots, the kind of place most people avoided unless they wanted to lose a boot in the muck. I carried my survey map, a walking stick, and a small metal probe, nothing fancy, just what I used to verify underground markers. About 20 feet from the shoreline, the stick struck something that didn't sound like rock. It gave a dull clang, hollow, metallic. I frowned, crouched down, and scraped at the soil until I saw it. A narrow, grayish pipe, almost invisible under a layer of mud and moss. At first, I thought it might be an old drainage line, maybe part of the original developer's runoff system. But the direction caught my eye. It didn't angle away from the lake, as any drainage would. It ran toward the HOA property. Curiosity turned to suspicion. I followed it slowly, marking the path as best I could. It ran in a perfect line, buried shallow at first, then deeper as it curved beneath the trail that bordered the HOA community green. When I reached the edge of their manicured lawn, I saw the faint trace of disturbed earth, a line that continued straight toward their irrigation control boxes behind the clubhouse. My stomach sank. No one buries pipe that long by accident. I returned the next day with a contractor friend who owed me a favor. He brought a ground scanner. "Let's see what kind of skeleton you've got here," he joked. 10 minutes later, the smile was gone from his face. "This isn't runoff," he said quietly. "This is an active line. See the density. It's pulling water, a lot of it." I stared at the scanner image. The pipe connected straight from the lake's western basin to the HOA's irrigation hub. The system wasn't drawing from the municipal supply. It was siphoning directly from a protected natural resource. They'd been stealing water for years. Lawn maintenance, car washing, boat rinsing, ornamental fountains, all powered by a silent theft buried in the dirt. I took photos, measured coordinates, sent myself timestamped notes, evidence, in case anyone tried to twist the story later. That evening, I called the Department of Natural Resources. The woman on the other end sounded weary but alert, like she'd heard one too many stories of people thinking they were above the law. "Do you have proof of the diversion?" she asked. "I have location data, photos, and a contractor witness." "Then we'll open an investigation," she said. "But understand, these things take time." "That's fine," I told her. "The lakes waited long enough." 2 weeks later they came. 4 white trucks bearing the DNR insignia rolled up the access road early one morning, followed by 2 sheriff's deputies and a county environmental officer. Linda and the HOA board were already out on the trail, arms folded, pretending not to stare. I led the officials down the muddy path to the exposed section of pipe. One of the DNR inspectors crouched down and brushed off the soil, tracing it with his gloved hand. "PVC grade," he murmured. "Pressure rated, not natural drainage." They followed the pipe's route, unearthing it section by section until it crossed into HOA property. The deputies took photos while another official recorded measurements. The closer we got to the clubhouse, the tenser the board members became. Finally, the inspector stopped at a large green control box tucked behind a hedge. "Here it is," he said, lifting the panel open. Inside was a network of valves, filters, and one thick pipe labeled Lake Source Input. Linda stepped forward, her voice sharp and defensive. "This is ridiculous. That's part of our irrigation system. It's been here since the subdivision was built." The inspector looked at her calmly. "Do you have a state water use permit authorizing withdrawal from a natural reservoir?" She blinked. "A what?" "Permit," he repeated. "Without one, this system is an environmental violation, and a serious one." Her color drained. "We assumed it was connected to the city's line." "Then you assumed wrong," he said. "This isn't municipal. This is siphoning directly from a protected ecosystem." One of the deputies turned to me. "You were right to call this in, sir." Linda spun on me, eyes blazing. "You had no right to bring outsiders here. You could have talked to us first." "I tried that," I said. "You called it trespassing." For once she had no answer. The DNR team spent hours documenting everything. They mapped out flow rates, photographed fittings, even took water samples to prove origin. By the time they were done, the evidence was indisputable. That afternoon, they issued the first citation, $25,000 for unauthorized water diversion, then another $10,000 for environmental damage, another for improper infrastructure. Within a week, the total topped $50,000, and the state warned there could be more pending further investigation. When the news hit the local bulletin, the neighborhood erupted. Homeowners were furious not at me but at their own board. Online forums filled with accusations. "You said we had legal access," one resident wrote. Another demanded Linda's resignation. The HOA's carefully curated image, the one built on control, pride, and pretense, began to crumble overnight. Meanwhile, the county installed a shutoff valve at the lake's edge. For the first time in years, the pumps went silent. The once perfect lawns began to brown in patches, their lush green fading under the summer sun. The ornamental pond near the clubhouse evaporated inch by inch. The illusion of their paradise was dying, exposed for what it really was, stolen beauty. One evening, as I stood by the waterline watching the last of the DNR trucks leave, Linda approached me quietly. Gone were the pearls and the confidence. She looked smaller now, like someone standing in the ruins of a kingdom she thought she'd built. "You could have ruined everything," she said softly. I turned to her. "I didn't ruin it, Linda. You did the day you decided my property was yours to use." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Then she turned and walked away, her shoes sinking into the damp earth where the pipe once lay. For a long moment, I just stood there, watching the water settle back into stillness. The lake looked untouched again, free from the silent theft that had drained it for years. The air smelled cleaner somehow, sharper, as if the land itself was exhaling relief. Justice doesn't always thunder in like a storm. Sometimes it seeps up quietly, from the mud, in the sound of a valve closing forever. I ran my hand along one of the cedar posts near the trail, the wood firm beneath my palm. The sign stood gleaming in the fading light. Private reserve, no trespassing. Owner ENFORCES rights. For the first time since this battle began, the words didn't feel like a threat. They felt like peace. The HOA had lost its grip on the land. And in doing so, they'd taught me something I hadn't expected to learn, that patience isn't just a virtue. It's a weapon. The HOA gathered again, this time in full-blown panic. I could hear the murmur of their voices even before I stepped into the community hall, a low buzz of desperation and blame. The polished hardwood floors, the faux mahogany table, the neatly framed mission statement about community harmony and environmental stewardship. It all felt like a cruel joke now. Linda sat at the head of the table, her pearl necklace trembling slightly with every nervous breath. Her once confident posture was gone. She looked smaller, thinner, like the storm had already passed through her. Around her, board members shuffled stacks of papers and cell phones, each screen glowing with bad news, legal notices, fine summaries, and messages from furious residents demanding answers. "Can we negotiate?" Linda asked, finally breaking the silence. Her tone wasn't commanding this time. It was brittle, almost pleading. I set my folder on the table and looked her square in the eye. "Negotiate," I repeated. "After stealing from the watershed for years, after trespassing, threatening, and lying to state officials." Her lips trembled. "We didn't know." "Yes, you did," I interrupted. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You built those pipes. You rerouted the drainage. You even painted over the boundary markers." A murmur rippled through the room. One man, Robert, their treasurer, slammed his hand on the table. "You can't just cut us off," he shouted. His face turned red, veins standing out on his neck. "Our irrigation depends on that water. The entire neighborhood will dry up." I leaned forward slightly. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before siphoning from a protected lake." Linda tried to regain control. "Look, this can be resolved," she said quickly, glancing around the room for support. "We're willing to make reparations. Maybe we could pay a smaller fine and—" I raised my hand. "Linda, the Department of Natural Resources is already handling the investigation. This isn't between us anymore. You crossed a federal line when you tapped into that lake. You don't get to bargain your way out of that." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Someone's phone buzzed again, another message, another demand from a homeowner wondering why their water pressure had dropped to zero. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, Linda spoke again, her voice trembling but sharp. "If you think this will end here, you're mistaken. We have lawyers. We have influence." I paused, hand on the doorframe. "You had influence," I said quietly. "Now you have a paper trail." By morning, their sprinklers sputtered to a stop. The lush, overwatered lawns that had once gleamed like golf courses turned patchy within hours under the summer sun. The HOA's prized fountain, the one they bragged about in every brochure, coughed up air and sludge before falling silent. Boat docks sat high and dry as the lake receded to its natural level for the first time in years. The waterline revealed rings of exposed mud, tangled reeds, and dozens of rusted sprinkler heads that had been hidden beneath the surface. Residents gathered along the shoreline, watching in stunned disbelief. Children pointed at the cracked earth where fish once swam. Older men shook their heads, muttering about property values and bad leadership. From my porch across the valley, I watched the scene unfold with a quiet kind of satisfaction, not vindictive, but resolute. Justice, in its purest form, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply lets nature reset the scales. By evening, Linda's voice echoed faintly through the still air as she argued with someone on the phone near the clubhouse. "No, I don't care what the DNR said. They can't do this to us." But they could, and they had. That night, for the first time in months, the valley fell silent again. No humming pumps, no artificial fountain spray, no angry HOA patrol trucks circling the gravel road. Just crickets, wind, and the slow murmur of the lake reclaiming itself. I sat back on my porch, the old wooden chair creaking beneath me, and took a slow sip of coffee. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. For all their rules, their signs, and their declarations of ownership, the HOA had forgotten the one law that could never be rewritten: nature belongs to no one. They sued me, of course they did. It was almost predictable, like the final act of a badly written play. Within a week of their water being cut off, I received the first notice: summons to appear, civil complaint for interference with community rights. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, as if they believed weight alone could give their lies substance. I stood on my porch reading it under the morning sun, the words practically dripping with self-importance. They accused me of unreasonable restriction of access, malicious conduct, and intentional harm to communal assets. In other words, for stopping them from stealing what wasn't theirs. I almost laughed, but instead I filed it neatly in a folder marked desperation. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one had Linda's name printed boldly across the top as president, Briarwood Lakes Homeowners Association. She had personally signed the complaint. The audacity was astonishing, but it also told me something. She was scared. When the hearing date finally came, the courthouse lobby buzzed with tension. HOA members arrived in a tight little cluster, whispering like anxious children before a parent-teacher conference. They wore their best suits, each trying to look respectable, professional, and wronged. Linda led the group, her pearls gleaming like armor. I walked in alone, holding my records, the deed, the title maps, the survey documents, and most importantly, the DNR inspection reports that confirmed the illegal pipeline. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and clinical. The judge, a silver-haired man with half-moon glasses, shuffled through the paperwork before sighing. "All right," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Let's begin." Linda's attorney, a sleek man in an overpriced gray suit, rose first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "my clients represent the Briarwood Lakes Homeowners Association, an established residential community that has, for years, enjoyed access to a shared waterway that Mr. Kellen has now restricted, causing significant hardship to hundreds of residents." The judge raised a hand. "Counselor, before we go further, is this shared waterway owned by the HOA?" The attorney hesitated. "Well, the lake has been historically used by the community and—" "Owned," the judge pressed. There was a pause. "Not technically, Your Honor, but the HOA has." The judge turned to me. "Mr. Kellen, do you have proof of ownership?" I stood, handing over a neatly bound folder. "Yes, Your Honor. Full title transfer from the previous land trust, dated 5 years ago, recorded with the county clerk's office." He flipped through the documents, eyebrows lifting slightly. "And the HOA was aware of this?" I nodded. They were notified twice, once by me and once by the Department of Natural Resources. They ignored both. The judge looked back at Linda's attorney. So your clients knowingly diverted water from land they didn't own. The attorney's composure faltered. Your Honor, the diversion was an unintentional oversight. The HOA acted under the belief. The judge cut him off again, this time with a faint chuckle. An unintentional oversight involving buried pipelines and illegal pumps. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom gallery. Linda's face flushed red. She shot a glare toward her attorney, who quickly looked down at his notes. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the bench. Counselor, your clients have no standing to bring this case. They have no ownership claim, no easement rights, and no legal justification for their actions. Case dismissed. He set down the file, his tone almost amused. Frankly, I suggest your clients focus their resources on paying those environmental fines instead of wasting the court's time. The gavel came down one sharp crack, and just like that, it was over. Linda's expression froze in disbelief. For a moment, I thought she might actually collapse. Her lips parted slightly, as if searching for words, but none came. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. I gathered my papers, nodded respectfully to the judge, and walked out. As I passed the HOA group, I heard snippets of panic. What do we do now? They'll have to raise dues. She said we had a case. Linda just stood there, pale as marble, watching her empire crumble. Outside, the air was warm and bright. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension of months finally begin to dissolve. The courthouse steps felt symbolic, one small rise from the mess they dragged me through. By the time I reached my truck, my phone buzzed. A notification from the local news outlet. HOA loses lawsuit after illegal water diversion exposed. State fines exceed $70,000. I smiled faintly. I hadn't contacted the press, someone else had. Maybe one of their own residents, finally fed up with the hypocrisy. That evening, I drove past the subdivision. The lawns that had once glowed unnaturally green now looked brittle and sunburned. Sprinklers sat idle, hoses coiled like useless serpents. The fountain at the center of their roundabout had been drained and filled with trash bags and dry leaves. A for sale sign leaned crooked near the entrance, the paint peeling under the heat. Beneath it, someone had scrawled in marker, HOA fees kill COMMUNITIS. As I passed, I caught sight of Linda standing by her mailbox, phone pressed to her ear, packing furiously. Her power suit looked wilted, her hair frizzed by humidity. For a woman who once ruled over the neighborhood like a queen, she now looked like someone fighting ghosts. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I simply drove on, the road bending back toward the valley where the lake shimmered peacefully again. Later that night, under the stars, I walked down to the water's edge. The moonlight glistened across the surface, calm, untouched, whole. For the first time in years, it felt like the land was breathing again. The frogs had returned. The reeds whispered softly in the breeze. I could even hear the faint splash of fish near the shallows, signs of life creeping back into what had once been stolen. I sat down on the old dock and listened to the water lap against the posts. The HOA had their meetings, their rules, their lawyers. I had patience, proof, and the truth, and in the end, that was enough. Linda's empire, her perfect suburban kingdom, had drowned under its own arrogance. And as I sat there watching the lake settle into its natural rhythm, I realized something simple and profound. You can drain a lake, pave a forest, or bury a pipeline, but nature always keeps the receipts. A month later, the letter arrived. It came in a heavy cream envelope, the kind you could tell mattered just by touch, embossed with the golden seal of the State Department of Natural Resources. No threats, no lawsuits, no demands for meetings or compliance. Just my name, handwritten neatly across the front, Mr. Henry Kellen. For a moment, I didn't open it. It sat on my kitchen table beside my coffee, a quiet mystery humming with the weight of officialdom. After everything that had happened, the protests, the court case, the screaming HOA meetings, I had learned to treat official mail like loaded weapons. But this one felt different. I finally slid a knife through the seal and unfolded the letter. The header gleamed with the state crest, and beneath it, the opening line made me blink twice. Dear Mr. Kellen, in recognition of your responsible management of the Briarwood watershed and your cooperation with the department's enforcement teams, we are pleased to inform you that you are being granted honorary stewardship rights over the protected water perimeter. Additionally, you will receive an annual tax credit in recognition of your efforts to restore and safeguard the natural habitat. I read it 3 times before it sank in. Honorary stewardship rights, legal custody, recognition, not punishment. For years, the HOA had treated me like the villain, the cranky old man with too much time and too many rules. Now the state itself had not only vindicated me, it had given me power that even they couldn't touch. I smiled, leaning back in my chair as sunlight spilled through the cabin windows. Outside, the lake glimmered through the trees, calm, blue, undisturbed. I could see the faint line where the HOA's fence used to sit before I had it removed. The land looked freer, wilder, more itself. The irony wasn't lost on me. Linda and her board had spent thousands trying to assert control over what they called community property. Now, that same land, the trails, the shoreline, the watershed, was under my stewardship by state decree. I set the letter down and let out a slow breath. For the first time since the whole feud began, I felt something that had been missing for a long time: peace. But the peace didn't come quietly. That afternoon, as I walked down to the lake, I saw a familiar silver SUV parked by the trail gate. Linda stood beside it, staring out over the water. Her posture was different: no clipboard, no power stance, no sharp-tongued entourage behind her. Just a woman, smaller than I remembered, the weight of defeat hanging off her shoulders. She turned when she heard my boots on the gravel. "You won," she said, her voice flat. "I didn't win," I replied. "The land did." She looked back at the water, silent for a long time. The surface rippled gently in the afternoon wind. "Do you know how many people are moving out?" she asked quietly. "Half the residents have listed their homes. The HOA broke. Nobody wants to pay dues anymore." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Linda exhaled shakily, like someone trying to breathe through regret. "We just wanted to make it beautiful," she said. "A nice community, somewhere people could be proud to live." I looked past her at the lake, the reeds bending, the herons gliding, the shimmer of sunlight across the water. "You tried to make nature fit your rules," I said softly. "That's not beauty, that's control." For a moment I thought she might argue, but instead she just nodded. Then she got back into her SUV and drove away without another word. I watched the dust trail vanish down the road, then turned back to the lake. The wind carried the sound of frogs and birds, the scent of wet soil and pine. It was like the earth itself had exhaled. That evening I took the letter, still crisp, still smelling faintly of state ink, and placed it in a simple wooden frame. I hung it above the mantel, right between an old photo of the property's original owner and a faded map of the watershed from the 1960s. It looked right there, like a missing piece of history returned home. Every so often, when I light the fireplace, the reflection of that letter dances in the glass frame, gold seal flickering like a medal earned not in battle, but in patience. It reminds me that justice doesn't always come fast, but it does come steady, like the slow rise of water after a drought. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing changes. The DNR sent a small team to restore native plant species along the shoreline. Volunteers came out on weekends to remove invasive weeds and clean debris. Even the wildlife seemed to recognize the shift. Turtles basked on the rocks again. Ducks nested closer to the reeds, and the fish population surged back. I began keeping a logbook, water levels, bird sightings, rainfall measurements, nothing formal, just notes for myself. The state called it stewardship, but to me, it felt more like listening. The land had a rhythm again, and all I had to do was stay quiet enough to hear it. Sometimes, on calm mornings, I'd catch the reflection of the framed letter in the lake itself, a symbol of what patience and persistence can earn against arrogance and greed. For years they tried to fence me out, to belittle me, to turn the law against me, but in the end it was the law and the land that stood by my side. I took a long walk along the trail that evening, past the cedar posts, past the signs that still stood where I'd first driven them in. Private Reserve, owner ENFORCES RIGHTS. Now they meant something more, not defiance but guardianship. When the sun set and the frogs began their chorus, I stood at the edge of the lake and said quietly to no one in particular, "This place takes care of those who take care of it." The water shimmered back at me, calm, content, whole. And above my mantle, that letter glowed softly in the firelight, the state's seal catching the light like a quiet crown. The HOA dissolved within 6 months. It didn't happen with drama or headlines, no courtroom explosions or public apologies. It simply fell apart, one resignation at a time, one foreclosure notice after another. The homeowner's website went offline first. Then the office at the clubhouse closed. Finally, the sign at the neighborhood entrance, Briarwood Lakes Community Association, was quietly removed one morning, leaving 2 rusted poles and a patch of overgrown grass where their pride used to stand. Most of the residents sold their homes and moved on. The ones who stayed learned to live without private beaches, restricted docks, or their beloved member-only barbecues. The community they had once guarded so fiercely had become what it was always meant to be, part of the valley again, not a walled kingdom pretending to own nature. With the HOA gone, the cleanup began. At first it was just me. I spent mornings walking the shoreline with heavy gloves and trash bags, pulling out old dock nails, soda cans, and bits of plastic left behind by years of lake parties. The waterline was lower now, exposing scars, discarded rope, half-buried beer bottles, even a forgotten paddle boat that had sunk near the shallows. It was sobering, seeing the cost of their community fun up close. Then slowly, others began to join me. A retired teacher from down the road brought his grandson, a quiet kid with freckles who loved turtles. A pair of birdwatchers came every weekend to help clear cattails and record sightings. A local scout troop spent a whole Saturday hauling out lumber and rusted fencing wire. No one needed to be paid or told what to do. They came because they wanted to see the lake healed. By midsummer, the change was visible. The shoreline that had once reeked of algae and chemical runoff now smelled clean again, damp earth and wild mint. Dragonflies darted over the water like shards of blue glass. I spotted frogs returning to the shallows, their calls echoing through the dusk. The Department of Natural Resources sent a small team to assist, a biologist, an engineer, and 2 young volunteers. They brought sensors, took water samples, and smiled when they saw how clear the readings were. "You've done half our job already," one of them told me. We planted cattails and pickerel weed near the northern inlet to filter runoff naturally. Native grasses began to reclaim the slopes where the HOA's landscaping had stripped everything bare. Within weeks, the muddy patches sprouted green again. On some days, I'd catch myself pausing mid-work just to take it in, the slow, stubborn return of balance. The sound of hammering had been replaced by the call of herons. The whir of lawnmowers gave way to the soft hum of bees. The water, once choked with oil sheens and soap residue from their boat washing, now reflected the sky cleanly, pure gold at sunset, silver by moonlight. One afternoon, while collecting debris near the old dock, I found something curious, a weathered sign buried in the mud. I pulled it free and wiped off the grime. The faded lettering read, Briarwood Lake's private property, members only. The irony made me smile. I carried it back to my cabin, leaned it against the porch, and later burned it in the fire pit that evening. The flames flickered bright orange, curling the wood until the last trace of those words turned to ash. By early autumn, the transformation was undeniable. Fish returned in schools. The frogs grew louder at night. Even deer began wandering closer to the waterline, unafraid. It was as if nature had been waiting all along, patient, watchful, ready to reclaim what arrogance had poisoned. Neighbors who once sneered at me now waved as they drove by. Some even stopped to thank me. One woman, whose husband had been part of the HOA board, left a small basket of apples on my porch with a note that simply read, "You were right. We forgot who this land belonged to." I didn't need an apology, but it felt good to see understanding bloom where hostility once lived. By November, we held what we jokingly called the Great Lake Cleanup Celebration. It wasn't fancy, just a small gathering by the water. A dozen volunteers, a few families, and some kids roasting marshmallows on sticks. Someone brought a portable speaker and played old folk songs. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the lake turned gold, smooth and unbroken. The reflection no longer shimmered with oil or soap bubbles, just light. Pure, honest light. I stood there for a long moment, hands in my pockets, watching the ripples fade. It struck me that the lake didn't need ownership, fences, or rules to thrive. It only needed respect, the kind that doesn't come from authority or paperwork, but from quiet hands doing the right thing. When darkness fell and people began packing up, I stayed behind, letting the sound of the water settle around me. The cattails whispered, the frogs croaked, and somewhere far off, an owl called across the valley. For the first time in decades, the lake breathed freely again. And in that breath, calm, clean, and endless, I finally felt the same. Linda moved away, not long after the HOA dissolved. Rumor had it she sold her house at a loss and moved to a condo in the city someplace with no lawns to water, no lakes to claim, no residents to control. Some said she took a job at a real estate firm downtown. Others whispered that she'd simply burned out. I never bothered to find out. The valley had a way of letting go of those who didn't belong here. The old HOA sign stood for months after she left, sun-bleached, rust creeping up their posts. "Community rules apply" hung half-cocked beside the empty gate, the letters flacking into nothing. Then one windy night, a storm rolled through, and by morning the signs were gone. Torn down by weather, by time, or maybe just by the land itself finally rejecting their presence. The gates never closed again. They creaked open to birds, to fishermen, to hikers who followed the sound of the water through the trees. What was once a fortress of restricted access had become a living trail again, wildflowers reclaiming the edges, moss spreading over concrete where security cameras used to hang. The land was breathing again, patient and free. Sometimes, when I walk the trail at dawn, I still see the faint outlines of what once was, the old fence posts half swallowed by soil, the stones where HOA members used to plant their neat little property boundary signs. They look like ghosts now, silent reminders of a lesson paid for in pride and fines. Ghost borders of greed and entitlement. The earth remembers, the water remembers, but nature in its quiet way also forgives. Every so often, I'll stop at the overlook where the lake spreads out like a sheet of glass. The surface glimmers gold in the evening sun, and below it, if you look close, you can see what lies beneath. The outlines of the old dock, the remains of a fallen signpost, a few sunken boards from the time they tried to build that illegal pier. Nature has covered them over in silt and shadow, as if saying, "This too shall sink and fade." It's humbling standing there. I came here years ago just to buy a view, a piece of peace, a little retirement dream by the water. But I ended up buying something much deeper than that: perspective. I learned that land doesn't bend for paperwork, That water doesn't care who draws the boundary lines. That ownership is a fragile illusion, a story humans tell themselves to feel safe, while the earth quietly endures, waiting for us to remember our place in it. The lake doesn't need fences to stay beautiful. It needs balance, something no HOA rulebook ever understood. I think about Linda sometimes, in that city condo surrounded by concrete. I wonder if she ever misses the sound of the frogs at dusk, or the way the lake glowed in late autumn when the wind was still. Maybe she does. Or maybe she's already found another community to manage, another set of rules to enforce. Some people need control the way others need oxygen. Me, I just need quiet. The valley gives me that now, a stillness that seeps into the bones. I spend most mornings walking the perimeter, not out of duty anymore, but gratitude. I check the cattails, count the turtle nests, make sure the runoff channels stay clear. Sometimes volunteers still stop by with gloves and buckets, though most of the heavy work is long done. The land doesn't need fixing anymore. It just needs tending. One afternoon last spring, a boy from a nearby town came fishing with his father. He caught his first sunfish near the northern inlet, right where the illegal pipeline used to run. When they reeled it in, both of them cheered, loud enough to startle the herons. I watched from my porch, smiling. That's the kind of sound this place was meant for: laughter, not lawsuits. As the sun sets, I often sit by the water's edge, toes brushing the cool mud, watching ripples fade into silence. The reflection staring back isn't just trees and clouds anymore, it's memory, healed and whole. The faintest echoes of the past still linger beneath the surface. The fights, the protests, the arrogance that once polluted the air. But they're quiet now, softened by time, buried beneath new growth. Nature doesn't erase history, it absorbs it, folds it into its rhythm until all that remains is the lesson. The lesson beneath the water. That peace doesn't come from winning or owning, it comes from letting go. You can fence beauty, tax silence, write rules against the earth. You can build gates, post signs, and call it progress. But in the end, nature keeps its own records. And when you finally listen, when you stop trying to command what should simply be respected, you realize something simple and extraordinary. We were never the masters here, only guests. The lake knows this. The trees know it too. And now, after years of noise and conflict, so do I. I came here to buy a view. Instead, I found peace, and left behind a reminder to a neighborhood and maybe to myself that no one truly owns the water. We only borrow its reflection for a while. And when the wind passes over the surface at dusk, carrying the scent of pine and earth, I swear the ripples seem to whisper it back. Remember, peace cannot be purchased. It must be protected.